All right, everyone, this is week 5, and we are covering politics and religion. I wanted to give a little bit of a background to refresh what we've learned and how it connects to this week, especially within the section on culture. So let's review a little bit. When we talked about the sociology of culture, we started out with this definition of culture as shared beliefs, values, and practices. But we also looked at how a culture affects our perception of reality, how it shapes how we understand and interact with the world. So specifically, we looked at things like race and gender, but also, anything that we believe about the world has been constructed through our interactions with other people, our history, and what we have been born into. The way we speak is a social construction, and it changes how we think and how we act. And we have to be socialized into that. So culture isn't something that we're just born into and then we immediately follow everything. We learn how to do that by people teaching us and also by us trying things out and having people enact social control onto us, right? So culture, social norms, social construction, socialization, etc. And then last week, we added on this idea of power. So, what are the influences on us and how do they affect us? And we specifically looked at power as being able to construct that reality, that social construction. And we looked at the constructions of race, gender, and sexuality and how those have a history, how they aren't as um, obvious or as natural as we might have thought. And then we read from Patricia Hill Collins' work on the matrix of domination to see how each of us are influenced by this power. And that gives us various degrees of oppression and privilege based on where we are situated in the world. So when she talks about race as oppression and privilege, she's not saying that black people are always oppressed and that white people are always privileged. But in today's society, there is a power dynamic where white individuals, on average, have more privilege and more ease of ability to go through life, whereas black folk and other people of color have more barriers to success in this society in this time. That does not mean it will always be this way because, as she said, the matrix of domination always includes resistance and people's ability to resist and fight back against that oppression. So then what's next is this question of who has this power? What are the specific groups that determine our culture, practices, and reality? And so, while each society is going to have a different structure of power and organizations that wield that power, this week we're going to focus on two things. We're going to focus on religion and politics. We're going to go into how social groups function as religions to create culture. And even if that group has no theology or metaphysical or spiritual belief, they still often operate as religions. And then we'll talk about different forms of politics and their power, and finally, how politics often function as religions. And then I'll preview the discussion activity that will help you move from this abstract notion of what is politics and what is religion. You'll watch a video that will specifically look at how religion and politics combine to create the abortion debate in the United States. So, religion. Let's start off, and I just want you to think for a second, what do all of these groups have in common? So, Christianity. Personally, I grew up Mormon, so Mormonism, Judaism, Hinduism, Satanism, even Satanism. What do all these groups have in common? And would it shock you if I argued that even these groups have some things in common with those? The White Sox, the Boston Celtics, Manchester City United, or is it just Man City? I don't know. Um, Harry Potter fans, anime fans, Beyonce fans. What do all of these groups have in common? Sociologists can look at all of these groups and find really similar religious tendencies. And let's get into what does that mean to operate as a religion. So religion is defined for sociologists as beliefs, practices, and values concerning what a person holds sacred or considers to be spiritually and socially significant. So what is important in all religions is there is some definition or demarcation between what is sacred and what is profane. This doesn't necessarily mean sacred as in it's holy or don't touch it or it's perfect, but sacred are things that are set apart and held in high esteem. Generally, they're things that shouldn't be destroyed or should be respected. Whereas profane are pretty much everything else, not necessarily evil, but they're things that are not sacred. So, sacred can often be both good and evil because, like, let's take Christianity and the devil today. You see a lot of. I actually just watched a movie this last week. It's called Veronica it's a Spanish movie where Veronica and her friends, they're teenagers, and they use a Ouija board to try to commune with Veronica's father who passed away. Um, the Ouija board in Catholicism is, at least in this movie, was displayed as something evil and something you shouldn't touch. That's still sacred in the thing that it is held, it is set apart, it shouldn't be, it's respected in the sense that you shouldn't be toying with it, you should leave it alone, you shouldn't be involved in it. So even sacred things doesn't necessarily mean it's good, but it's something that's held in high esteem or at least has a lot of significance to it. So that's the first important element of a religion is this differentiation between beliefs, practices, and values that are sacred, and then things that are just mundane or like basic, like day-to-day things. Second are religious rituals. These are behaviors or practices that are either required or expected of members of the group, and these hold a really important function. They help the group reinforce the religious experience. They help everyone get involved. They help you separate and reaffirm what is sacred. So during religious rituals, you often are putting that importance on sacred beliefs and practices. So, for example, you might be chanting praises to God, which is a religious ritual, putting importance onto the sacred belief of God and God itself. It might even be when you are, for example, if we take like a Black Lives Matter protest as a religious event, and during that you are chanting, which would be a kind of ritual, something like say her name after the death of Breonna Taylor, that is putting sacred or high esteem onto the life of Breonna Taylor and other people who have been killed. So one of the elements of religious rituals is to put that sacred nature onto an idea, onto a practice, or onto a belief. And then finally, we have religious totems and symbols. These totems or symbols are representations of the religious feeling and group. It's an image of the group or religion that they use to kind of carry with them as a reminder of that religious experience or of the religion in general. So the idea is, you see in a lot of religions, you praying to a certain symbol, whether that's a cross or putting your hands on a Bible. Those are religious symbols that help you remember the religious devotion, the religious experience, or that religious sacred belief and value. So these are the three important elements of a religion: sacred and profane beliefs and practices, rituals, and then totems. So back to what do all these groups have in common? Let's look at Christianity and the White Sox. Now, I understand that Christianity is super broad and that there are many different aspects. We're just going to look at it kind of basic, Christianity writ large. And let's look at all three of these issues: sacred versus profane practices. We've got things like sin and righteousness versus your everyday actions, right? So eating breakfast isn't necessarily sin or righteous It's more of a profane practice that doesn't really have anything. But sin is also seen as sacred, and righteousness is seen as sacred because they're both actions that are have value or have some significance to them. God and Satan, the belief or the values of charity versus pride, these are all sacred ideas in Christianity. The religious rituals, we have things like the sacraments, you have baptism, the weekly worship, or maybe more than weekly worship. I know that they are called a lot of different things, so I'm just going to say worship when you go and you take communion or you hear your preacher give a sermon, reading sacred texts, singing. All of these things are different kinds of religious rituals. And then finally, the symbols and totems. I think the most common one in Christianity is the cross, but you could also imagine the church itself being a religious totem, the Bible, the robes that a priest wears. These all have some kind of element of a symbol and some element of like the religious beliefs intertwined with those symbols, right? When you see a priest in his robe, or I can't remember what the collar is called, um, or the nun's habit, you instantly know what that means because it is a religious symbol. So, how do we see something similar with the White Sox? First, you might say that they have a sacred belief that they're better than the Cubs or better than the Red Sox or better than the Milwaukee Brewers, right? Um, the that Chicago or Comiskey dogs are better than other kinds of hot dogs. Or that you should always support your players and that the umps get it wrong. Things like that. Those are this is definitely a looser religion than Christianity, but you can see that there are still sacred practices, beliefs, and values within it. Um, One way to tell when there is something sacred is the amount of social control. So if you showed up to a Sox game wearing a Cubs jersey, you're definitely going to get at least some side eyes, if not some people asking you why you're there or why you're wearing that jersey. Um, so these are sacred practices and values for this group specifically. So we have to, if you showed up to, for example, the DMV wearing a Cubs jersey, no one's really going to look at you wrong or say you're not supposed to wear that. So this is a sacred value for the Chicago White Sox specifically. There are religious rituals, whether it's cheering when someone scores, booing when the other team does something, singing the White Sox um, theme. I've never been to the White Sox stadium, so I had to look this up. Apparently, let's go White Sox. Sure. The national anthem is a big religious ritual during American sports. So these are all different kinds of things that we do that create a religious kind of excitement or energy within everyone that connect us to the group. And then finally, the religious symbols and totems. We have right here the White Sox emblem. You could think of Southpaw, the mascot, the field players and their jerseys, right? We go out and buy players' jerseys. We wear them with their name on the back to kind of show pride and remind us that, we're a fan of the White Sox. So in various ways, these are the White Sox do operate as a religion. And we can see elements of religion in a lot of our daily lives and the social groups we interact with often. Again, this isn't to say that religion isn't real or that beliefs don't exist or that, if you are religious that you're wrong. It's looking at the ways in which sociologists look at how humans interact and that they've noticed that we interact religiously with other groups. So, um, as you're reading and thinking about the material this week, think through why do social groups tend to act religiously? We could say that it provides meaning and inclusion and community, right? We feel like we're a part of something. It organizes social groups. You have norms and practices that you know you're supposed to do. It organizes your activities so you don't really have to think as much. Um, conflict theorists might argue that it provides power over society, especially if we think of, the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church and was, controlled most of Europe. Today, a lot of the Middle East is adheres to norms of Islam, um, and various other countries have state religions. So conflict theorists would often look at what power is it providing. Um, they also look at how religion either justifies inequality or perhaps provides the basis or organization for social change. So a lot of sociologists and other social scientists have looked at how religious beliefs will often justify inequality and saying, like, don't worry if you're poor, God will compensate you in the next life, or if you're rich, that's because God's favoring you, right? So these justifications for inequality, but also religions have served the basis for social change. Alden Morris, who you read from in the first week, who wrote the piece on the second site, his analysis for most of his career has been how Black churches provided the basis and organization for the civil rights movement. And so religion isn't necessarily the thing perpetuating inequality, but it has a place in how inequality happens. So think about these things. Why do you think social groups tend to act religiously? But now we're going to move on to politics. Politics are a society's governance structure and practices. How do people come together and organize themselves? Who do they let have authority over them, or who takes authority, and what are the practices involved? Here we have the forms of governance talked about in the book. I have on the left those forms of governance that are either less strict or that the masses own more of the power. And on the right, you have those forms of governance that are more strict or power is concentrated among very few or even a single person. So let's start left to right. So anarchy is simply the absence of organized government. That does not necessarily mean that everyone is up for themselves. There are a lot of different thoughts of how anarchy would work, actually. However, it is generally the idea that there is no gigantic governing body over many groups. Communism, I put true communism up there because if I don't remember if I said this when we looked at Marx, but when he saw what happened in Russia with communism, he said, if that is Marxism, I'm not a Marxist. He argued this is not what he envisioned. True communism is the idea that the majority of society rises up and distributes the wealth and materials of a society equally, and then as a complete group decide on how to run society. That's kind of similar in a way to direct democracy. This is the idea that every single person votes on every single item of government, and then the majority rules in each of those. This was something practiced in ancient Greece. There aren't, that I can think of, there is not a place that actually practices direct democracy. Usually you see what we have in the US, representative democracy. This is when the people vote for someone to represent them in the government. So that's what we do today. We elect our aldermen, we elect our state representatives, we elect our national representatives, and they are the ones who go and actually vote on the policies and create the policies, rather than like us general citizens voting on the policies. Next, you have kind of the idea of governance that is held or power is held by a small elite group. Generally, this is known as an oligarchy. So if you're listening and watching what's going on in Russia or anything about Russian politics, they'll often talk about Russian oligarchs. And that's because a lot of the power in Russia is held by a small group of very wealthy individuals who pull the strings in Russia along with Vladimir Putin. Um, there is also a form of governance that I don't think has ever necessarily existed, but it's called an epistocracy. This is a government by the knowledgeable or by the wise. It's mostly an ideal. The idea is that we should have people who are the most knowledgeable running the government rather than necessarily direct democracy. And in fact, our founding fathers wanted something more of an epistocracy or an epistocratic democracy, where very few people actually had voting power, and they wanted to restrict that voting power among the learned and the wealthy. And that has changed over time. Some journalists and other activists often claim that the US is actually an oligarchy, that because of the influence of money and corporations in politics, that money has a stronger sway in government than any of the citizens voting. So they often see this as simply an oligarchy as well. Then we move towards a monarchy and dictatorship. So a monarchy is where a single person or a couple rule until they die or abdicate the throne. You can have absolute monarchies where the monarch has full power, or constitutional monarchies where governments recognize monarchs but require these figures to abide by law. Generally, though, monarchs still abide by tradition, even if it is not necessarily a constitutional monarchy. Then there are the dictatorships. I put this at the farthest end because, unlike a monarchy that is held by tradition, dictatorships are generally set up and like wield their own power and create their own rules. So this is not a perfect, analysis, but it kind of gives you a different spread of the ideas that we have. And generally, most of the Western world is falling within this area of representative democracy and oligarchy. And you can see how multiple of these forms might exist at once. All right, so in the UK, for example, they have a constitutional monarchy where the Queen is the head of state, but they also elect their representatives. Now, Weber also gave us an analysis of ways that power is exercised specifically in the form of authority. Now, he argued that is legitimate authority in which people are accepting the kind of power that is over them, and there's illegitimate authority in which force or coercion must take place. So there are three types, he argues. The first is legal rational authority. This is the kind of authority where there are laws in place that govern how authority can be used in what cases. And we often see that in terms of the presidency of the US or elected leaders that have specific legal rules and policies that they must follow in how they use their authority. Traditional authority is the ability to use authority as long as it is within tradition, and often these traditions are viewed as divine or at least long-standing and thus legitimate. This is the King of Saudi Arabia, and that monarchy is a traditional form of authority because it is over time and they adhere to their tradition. And then charismatic authority is those people who have a magnetism about them, whether that is seen as divine or just exceptional or charismatic, and people follow them because of that charisma. And here I have a picture of Stacey Abrams, who technically has no legal authority at the moment, nor does she have any traditional authority, yet people follow her because she is charismatic. She has a very strong power of attracting people to her cause, and thus has a form of authority. Okay, So let's go to see how politics act as a religion. Here I have the GOP and the Democratic symbols, the elephant and the donkey, and they often act in religious ways. So we could think of various sacred beliefs and practices on each side, whether that's the family, whether that's we should intervene in inequality, whether that's law and order politics or personal responsibility or social duty. But each of them have different religious rituals, right? Voting, campaigns. It was very important for Trump's election to get to have big rallies, whereas a lot of Democrats kind of follow a some rituals of protest. That's a big part on the Democratic side. And then you have religious symbols and totems, whether that's the elephant or the donkey. Both might look at the Constitution, the flag. A lot of Democrats are put up a lot of a wide variety of flags, whether that's the LGBT flag or a Black Lives Matter flag, etc. And then I put up MAGA and Hope as two well-known symbols from previous elections by Donald Trump and Barack Obama. So, in a way, the identification with one of these political parties often functions as a religious experience. So in the activity forum, what you're going to be doing is watching a video on Paul Ryrick, who got evangelicals who were previously not interested in politics to become involved by stirring up abortion as a controversy. The prompts that I want you to respond to are there, but specifically think about what united the religious right. Why did Ryrick want evangelicals to start voting? And how have abortion politics become a kind of religion for the GOP? How are politics and religion connected? So that's this week's material. I think it's a fascinating idea to look at the world as social groups, as religions, and seeing how power is wielded in different governance structures. Let me know if you have any questions. Remember that the next investigating sociology assignment is due this Sunday. And thanks and have a great week.